Welcome students of creative writing. I'm Sanam Khanna from the Department of English, Kamla Nehru College, University of Delhi. And today we are going to discuss structures of material. In other words, what do you require to put together? What do you need to have sorted out in your mind before you actually begin writing? So, in the general principles of writing, we've dealt with fundamental norms of writing. Your discussion was largely theoretical and introductory. We've already, in one sense, discussed with you the need for lucidity, authenticity, credibility, and what do we mean by an authorial voice. Our focus here in these lessons is now really to introduce you to the creative impulse. What is it? How do we define it? What are its origins, and how are the origins of the creative impulse related to what you decide to write about or the theme of your writing? We'll also discuss the genuineness of the creative impulse, because that's an important factor in how your writing will shape, how your motivation to write will take shape. And we will discuss another important point which you need to park in your mind, which is that the creative impulse is distinct from the idea of social and political motivation. So they are related, but they are also distinct from each other, and you need to be able to put your finger on those distinctions. So let's look at our focus as we begin to write. How do you decide on a theme? Where do the ideas for themes come from? Is it spontaneous? Is it deliberate? Do you work your way through? Do you just sit down one day and say, okay, this is what I want to write about? Different people have different processes, and you have to figure out what works for you. But what you need to know is what is the creative impulse, and you need to test for yourself, is it genuine or is it not genuine? We will move on to the preparatory stages of writing, which is about creating atmosphere, characters, how you will bring your experience and observation into that writing, what kind of research you need to do before you write, and of course the importance of a writing routine. But those come later. Our focus right now is on the idea of the creative impulse. So, you are using the word creative, but let's just recap. What does creativity mean? It's a mental process. It involves the generation of new ideas, or at least associations between new ideas and concepts. It usually involves divergent thought, which is you're not looking for a single right answer, but you are looking for connected points that together make something that's right, that sounds right, that feels right. And this is usually called divergent thinking. What is an impulse? An impulse is literally, at its most basic, the strong desire to do something. So let's look now at the Webster's Dictionary definition of creative impulse. It says, the conscious use of skill and creative imagination, especially in the production of aesthetic objects. Now there's a lot to unpack here, literally. What does the word skill mean? What does creativity mean? What is aesthetic? So skill literally means that it's learned. It's something that you acquire. It maybe you have a talent which is inborn, but it needs to be honed. Creative, we've already discussed. Imagination, of course, is what's in your mind, how you conjure up, create, put it together. But let's look at this term aesthetic objects, because aesthetics is not in isolation. It does not exist in isolation. It's deeply connected to the idea of beauty, of appropriate, of what is good, and therefore it also implies a certain amount of social formation. What is aesthetic and acceptable in one culture may not be aesthetic and acceptable in another culture. So that we are also saying the creative impulse in many ways is a coming together of various ideas gleaned from your society, which take a certain unique form in the writer or creative artist's mind. So what is an idea? When we talk about creativity, we talk about ideas, having ideas. And here is a very simple, lovely illustration by the writer and illustrator Linda Barry, who also teaches creative writing. And she says what it is. What is an idea? And literally she's saying it's many things. It's made up of the future, it's made up of the past, it could be real, it could be imagined, but it's something that's haunting you, it's in your mind and you want it to take some kind of concrete form. And that's how an idea leads to a theme and then finally to a creative piece. So now let's look at the introduction to creative impulse. I discussed the idea of aesthetics. What is aesthetics? The Oxford English Dictionary says it's the skillful production of the beautiful in visible form. So when you create a painting or you create a sculpture or you create a piece of writing, it is something that's beautiful in a visible form. It appeals to the cultural imagination of the audience that you are writing for. But we have to go a little deeper then. We are saying, all right, aesthetic is related to art, but what's art? And one of the most timeless definitions comes from the Greek writer Aristotle. He says the aim of art is not to represent outward appearances of things, but their inward significance. So that in one sense, art captures the essence. Now that may sound like a cliche, but if you look at what are the pieces of art or writing that you really admire, you realize they're not reflecting, they are actually transmuting, they're creating something new from that which is already recognizable and putting it in a manner which is so very concentrated, so very unique that it stays with you. So how do we create a creative impulse? What are its origins? And therefore also, what is the origin of the theme that you will finally work with? And you'll realize that they are closely related, how your creative impulse shapes up and how your theme then is linked to that creative impulse. The first source, and the one that you're most likely to be familiar with, is observation or experience, which is usually clear, concrete. It's maybe things that you write in a diary, things you note down, and it's very important as a writer to keep a little notebook where when you notice something unusual, something that strikes your eye, you make a note of it, and that in one sense helps you recall your experiences and observations. The second source may be a memory. Maybe something from your childhood, maybe you saw something you saw which didn't strike you as important then but keeps coming back to you, and it may be sort of blurry, not very distinct, but it's made an impact on you and it's there in your subconscious and you want to work on it. The third source may be an idea or a situation you want to highlight. So perhaps you've noticed something around you, some injustice, some cruelty, maybe somebody spoke harshly to a friend of yours and you realized how much it hurt your friend, and the person who said it didn't actually mean it that way or didn't realize it would sound so harsh, and you want to make a short story or a poem. You want to develop that idea further. That may be an idea or a situation. The fourth source is imitation or extension, and this is very often where many of us start as young children, as young creative people, where you copy a piece of writing, or as an artist you copy an artist you admire. Now that's a perfectly valid place to start. It's usually, like I said, the first stepping stone that leads us to where we want to go, but it's perhaps not a place you want to dwell. You want to take it further, you want to develop your own unique style. So while imitation or extension is fine to practice your writing, eventually you should move on to develop a distinct style of your own. So how do you nurture that creative impulse? What do you need to do as a creative artist to nurture it? And always the answer is that you should be receptive, you should be aware of the world around you, you should be observant, you should notice things, you should be empathetic. And literally empathetic means you should be able to connect with others, think like them, put yourself in their shoes, and perhaps experience the world as they might experience it. So it means standing outside of yourself and your experiences and being able to think and absorb the world as someone else. You should be committed to putting your ideas into writing. A lot of us have lots of ideas, lots of feelings, and we feel that at some point I'm going to sit and write them down. But unless you actually start writing, you won't have a piece of writing to work on. So it's important to start writing. You need to be disciplined. Once you've started writing, you need to stick with that idea, you need to develop it further, you need to have the commitment to write and rewrite, because that's an essential part of writing. And you need to be able to manage your time. Time skills, once you start writing, you may be drawn into a story, you may forget about sleeping or eating or conversely, you've got stuck and then you don't want to get back to your writing, you keep putting it off. So you need that sense of discipline and time management to keep you focused on your goal, to make you practice your writing. Sometimes, you just need to say to yourself, I will write for 20 minutes, I will write 500 words, see where it gets you. You may use some of it, you may use none of it, but it's like practicing anything else. If you want to get better, say at tennis or playing the piano, you would practice every day. So writing, if you're going to develop it as a skill, is something that you also need to practice regularly. And you need to figure out what schedule works for you, daily, weekly, whatever the routine is. Develop it and then stick to it. Once you've done that, you realize it's like a road, and then you keep going down that road. So once you've got the idea, once you've got the creative impulse, how do you realize or how do you test whether it's something that you should now build on? These are the questions you need to ask yourself. Is it interesting? Will it be of interest to my audience, to my readers? Sometimes it may be an unpleasant truth that you want to present, and the first reaction may be, oh, maybe they won't like it, maybe it's not something that they will find interesting. But if you feel that it's something that you need to take further, commit yourself to it. Make it relatable, because that's very important, that you reach out to your audience and make those experiences, make those ideas of yours something that they want to read further, they can relate to. And it should be aesthetically appealing. But usually this is the last step. This is how you will then shape your writing, change your words, perhaps juggle around your paragraphs, get the continuity and the form that you need. But you also need to keep that in mind. What is aesthetically appealing to my audience? And one of the oldest definitions, one of the most popular definitions of the idea of creativity is, of course, from Wordsworth, where he says poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origins from emotion recalled in tranquility. Look at how very cleverly Wordsworth has woven in that paradox of spontaneous overflow of emotion, which is the first step. But the second, the writing process, depends really on that recollected in tranquility, so that nobody is ever writing the moment you've seen something, when suppose there's a war or there's something that, a fire. You're not writing at that point, you're writing later. So you are recollecting in tranquility, and that tranquility is also the point at which you will exercise your aesthetic judgment. You will read the piece as an outsider, reread it as an outsider, and say, okay, this is working, this is not working. You will hone your piece in order to make it more creative, something that's more to the taste of your audience, something that will hit home. So what we're saying then is that every strong emotion or desire to write is not necessarily a foundation for creativity. The creative impulse must be that traditional kind of balance between mind and heart, emotion and skill. And so you need to test the genuineness of the impulse by asking yourself, will I still feel as strongly about this topic or issue later in time, a month later, a week later, a year later? Will others feel as strongly, or can I make them feel as strongly about this issue, this idea that I have at the moment? When my audience reads it, maybe much time will have passed between the time of your writing and the time of your audience reading it. Will it still connect? Will I still be able to connect with it? Will I want to work on it, when this moment or this emotion has passed? And importantly, can you recreate that moment with authenticity and sincerity? Are you giving a colored perspective? Are you giving only one point of view? Will you be able to bring in balance? Will you be able to, in that sense, create a combination of both mind and heart, emotion and skill? And here, Truman Capote, who's a very famous American novelist, his advice is really relevant. He says, I have to exhaust the emotion before I feel clinical enough to analyze and project it. So you have that spontaneous overflow of emotion, step one, but then the exhaustion of the emotion and the ability to analyze and project that recollected in tranquility. And look at the word he's using, analyze. So literally you're standing outside of yourself and reading or writing almost as thinking through this idea through the eyes, through the mind of your audience. And he says writing has laws of perspective, of light and shade, just as a painting does, or music. If you're born knowing them, fine. If not, learn them. Then rearrange the rules to suit yourself. So this is where the idea of aesthetics, the rules comes in, that there are things you need to learn, skills you need to hone, you need to perfect. So start, create, and then don't be afraid of recreating your own piece, working on it till you have some idea of perfection, however remote it may be, something that you have in your mind, some standard which you then achieve. Usually the first draft is never the draft that you will continue with. You will rewrite it, you will reshape it, you will choose different words, different sentences, different paragraph breaks before your writing becomes something that you are familiar with, something that you feel, I connect. This is something that now I feel is matching my idea of perfection. So that editing, re-editing, recreating, all of this comes if your creative impulse is genuine, if you're willing to stick to the idea, if you are willing to be sincere and commit yourself to it. Now this is the part where I mentioned that you need to be very clear in your mind that the creative impulse is not the same as a social or political motivation. So, we ask ourselves, why does a writer write? What comes first, motivation or creativity? Should social or political motivation dominate? Sometimes you feel that there is so much injustice in society. You may have someone you've seen, like I said, who suffered through some social norm, and you want to highlight that. But if you are writing with purely that perspective, if it doesn't have authenticity, if it doesn't have experience, then it will not connect with your audience, it will not ring true. So you need to kind of bring together observation, experience, motivation, look at the world around you and ask yourself, what am I writing? Why am I writing? Who am I writing for? Art should never become propaganda. And what's propaganda? Something that is putting forth just one point of view. Usually we say a dominant point of view, but it's definitely biased. And truly great art is never propaganda. Truly great art, in one sense, transcends the personal and historical boundaries of the time they were written in, which is why we can still read a play by Kalidas or poetry by Wordsworth or a novel by Dickens, and connect with those circumstances because it's transcended the historical boundaries. It's beyond the time that it was written, and it still speaks to people 100 years later, 1,000 years later. Those impulses, those concerns are still there in society. And so that's how you need to ask yourself. Keep testing your work, keep testing your impulse, and also how you are writing. What's propaganda? Let's just spend a little time so that you understand this very important term. In Propaganda and Persuasion, this is a book written by Jowett and O'Donnell. They say propaganda is a careful, measured, organized effort to mold and influence the opinion and thoughts of a population. It is meant to steer behavior in a certain direction in order to get a required response. It is often used to manipulate the thoughts of people. Now you might say that if I'm seeing an injustice, definitely I want people to know it's an injustice. I want them to feel the way I feel. How do you make sure that what you're writing is not propaganda? So we talk about covering both sides of the coin, in one sense giving both sides of the picture, relating that particular experience to larger experiences in society. At the end of your story or your poem or whatever it is, the piece that you are writing, you should not be forcing your audience into one single perspective or one single conclusion. A good work of art has multiple layers to it. It has multiple ways of reading. And therefore, if you are really interested in creating a great piece of writing, you need to keep that in mind. So we said, ask yourself, what is the desire? What is propelling me to write this particular piece? Be honest with your motivation. Document the idea, perhaps see how others have already dealt with it so that you're not replicating it, so that you may get ideas which are unique, something that you can either expand on or make personal. Balance the creative with any other impulse. A piece of creative writing has to be creative first. It cannot be propaganda. But this does not mean that you shy away from difficult topics. You need to accept and acknowledge that all works of art, no matter which period they are written in or who is the creator, they are shaped by the circumstances in which the creator, the author, lives. And that means social, political, cultural norms, conditions of that period will obviously be reflected not just in the writing, but in also the mindset of the author. All of these are important influences. However, art must be created with sensitivity and commitment to the artistic process. And we've already discussed what is art, what is aesthetics. So you need to keep this in mind. Let's discuss how does an author make the creative and the social come together. And we'll look at Paro Anand's two books. I'll focus on No Guns at My Son's Funeral, but it has a follow-up called Weed, where she's looking at the very delicate situation of militancy in Kashmir. But she writes through the perspective of a child. So she is, in one sense, committed to looking at this very troubled situation, but she's also bringing a very unique creative perspective on it. Look at how she brings the character to life, how she brings his surroundings to life. When the book opens, we read, the clink of teacups, the sound of the kerosene stove being fired up, the wood smoke smell of kangris being freshened. Aftab woke to the smells and sounds of familiar security. He lay in bed, snuggling into his blanket. It had been his father's. It still held his scent. Look at how the world of Aftab is coming alive for the reader. The sights, the sounds, the sensations. A little bit of his past is also revealed here. So you can feel as if you're entering into Aftab's world. And somewhat later in the book, in another section, she talks about Aftab's mother, Ammi. And look at how the character of Ammi emerges without the author telling you about Ammi. And this is something that we often say in creative writing, that you should show, not tell. So look at how she shows you Ammi. Ammi wouldn't hear of marrying her daughter to anyone who'd held a gun, for one side or the other. Hands that had cradled a killing gun would never rock her grandchild, she had promised. So you already know that Ammi has strong opinions. You now know that there is, that Aftab has a sister who is of marriageable age, and so that this is the situation of the family. So how very delicately all these facts are brought to the reader's attention, and you're literally entering the world, living through the situation in Kashmir, seeing it through the eyes of a child. Somewhat later in the book, when we have what's called an encounter, Paro Anand writes, blood. There was blood everywhere. The rushing river sucked at the wound like a hungry demon. Look at how that sentence shapes up, what kind of imagery is conjured up. But the ice numbed the pain, and that was good, and it would throw the dog off the scent. And then we move to the antagonist, who's Akram. Akram was a creature of the mountains. He could outwit a snow leopard if he needed to. He found a pool looping out from the river, part of it yet apart. Overhanging rocks and creepers sheltered it. He pulled up some reeds and quickly bound his shattered leg and disappeared with the faintest ripple under the water. Look at how the sights and sounds of Kashmir, so you've moved beyond Aftab's world, you've moved outside into the natural world, something that you might think is very beautiful, but when we are seeing it through the perspective of another character, we also realize how much sorrow, how much danger that very beautiful scenery holds. So speaking about her own writing, Paro Anand says, I don't intellectualize my writing process or stories. I write the story as it comes to me. So this whole idea of the spontaneous overflow, that you first write as much as you can write and then let the story take shape. Somehow I find the voice of young people is the correct one for me. By which she means that she wants to write as a young protagonist. She says, somehow I find the young people, the voice of young people is the correct one. The skin I can inhabit, the voice I can speak. I write from the head, not much from the heart, not much from the head. That part, head, comes into action at the rewrite and editing stage. Look at that word, rewrite. Here's an author who's saying, I first write from the heart, and then I sit down and, in that sense, analyze my own writing, and I'm not afraid to rewrite. So that we talk of the creative impulse, the social, the political, and how all of them can come together to create a very powerful piece of writing once the author is committed to living in that world, living with that idea. And so she talks about how the ideas come to her, how does she bring in authenticity, how does she bring in sincerity, something that we talked about earlier. She says the difficult circumstances I have encountered range from children living in war-torn zones, children of poachers, orphan children growing up amidst domestic violence, or worse. But children anywhere deal with issues like bullying, isolation, body image issues, divorce, death of a parent, and so on. Let's face it, teenage years are dark, she says. Stories are a safe space where they can find that they are not alone, or what it feels like on the other side. So you can see how she's writing for an audience, kind of anticipating what the audience reaction will be and introducing them, like she says, to stories from the other side, the world that they don't know, but she is doing it with authenticity and sincerity, with a combination of head and heart. She says, I think stories are a great way to create an empathetic generation who pay more than lip service to the world's problems. So she's not hiding, in one sense, her social or political motivation that drives her to write a story. She's telling you right there why she writes. But like I said, if you go through her novels, there is no sense of didactism. There's no sense of an author preaching to you. She writes with that sense of authenticity, that commitment of making an aesthetically appealing, powerful piece of fiction. She says, for me, I want my books to be a call to action, a weapon of positive change. And in one sense, all great art is introducing you to some idea so that you can change the world for the better. It's introducing you to things you may not have experienced or showing you something you've experienced in a new way so that your own sensibility develops. And that's what Paravanand is saying. She says, I have worked with over 3 lakh children over the years and the number keeps growing. I'm endlessly inspired by them and astonished by this generation. It gives me so much hope for our future. They are powerful beings and I would love to play a tiny role in equipping them to be agents of positive change. So she's not denying that she wants her books to be something that makes the audience become an agent of positive change. But like I said, at no point is she sacrificing the creative impulse. At no point do her books become propaganda. She manages to keep the balance, to keep the aesthetic impulse and the creative impulse in perfect balance. So let's just recap what we've spoken about today. What are the features of the creative impulse? It's not just a strong or superficial emotion. It is recurrent and empathetic in nature. And this is really important to understand when we talk about the empathetic in nature. It's not just something you feel, you know that you are feeling this because it is important to others as well. It's important to you, but to others as well. It needs distancing from the event in terms of time and impersonality. So this ability to analyze, to bring your mind into play once your heart has had its say is an important point to keep in mind. It is concretized through a mixture of experience, observation and imagination. So like I said, the first impulse for writing is usually something you've seen, then your imagination comes into play, your observations come into play, and lastly your sense of aesthetics also comes into play. It may arise from factual events, memories, subconscious desires. It creates a motivation, a desire to be creative. It can be cultivated and developed into a short story or poem as long as you are committed to the idea, willing to work with it, willing to develop it further. So let's test our understanding when you go through this unit. What are the questions you need to ask yourself? How will you distinguish a creative impulse from an emotional reaction? Why is it important to distance yourself from the object of your creative writing? Explain the connection for yourself between the creative impulse and motivation. A really important question to ask yourself is, what do you understand by the word art? And it's always useful to look at things that you've liked in the past. It may be a piece of writing, it may be a novel, a poem, a short story. Kind of put them together, see what has appealed to you. Ask yourself, what is propaganda? What is its relationship with art? If you have liked a particular piece of writing or a painting, what is it telling you? Is it shaping your imagination? Is it telling you something about the world? If so, how is it doing it? Think about stories which appeal to you and try and learn more about the writer's motivation for writing. This is always a very, very good exercise to undertake for a creative writer. Find a piece that you really admire, try to learn more about it, try to learn about how the writer wrote it, how many times was it rewritten, how was it shaped, and you will find lessons which are important for you. Once you've got the idea for the story or poem, once you've got the idea of the creative impulse sorted out and therefore you've worked on a theme, developed it further, once you have that idea for a piece of writing, how do you prepare for it? The next step is literally the mechanics of writing. The composing, once you've composed it, organizing, reorganizing, and the last step, sometimes it may lead to a complete rewrite, is of course the editing. Now, what are the few terms that you need to know when you are working on being a creative writer. You need to know what is theme, plot, character, location, atmosphere, what is conflict and resolution, how are these terms related to any piece of writing. Even a poem, for example, you might say, oh, it just has a theme, but even a poem works through the idea of a conflict, a resolution, an idea, how it's presented, how it ends. In a novel or a short story, it's easier to see the conflict and resolution at work, but it's there in every kind of piece of writing. And we will, in the lessons that follow, look at each of these terms and work through them in greater detail. Thank you.